Welcome back, everyone. So imagine spending an entire year without going to the grocery store or snacking on things like chips or even not drinking coffee. Well, that's what our next guest did when she decided to feed her family only food locally grown and hunted in her hometown of Dawson City, Yukon. Filmmaker Suzanne Crocker shares her story in a new Hot Docs documentary called First We Eat, and she joins us now. Welcome.
Thank you.
Hi, Suzanne. The documentary is wonderful, and we have a million questions about it. So let's start with this one. You are a retired family doctor who, by your own admission, wasn't really, the best in the kitchen. So what made you want to embark on this journey?
Well, there is only one road into the Yukon, and 97% of our food comes in through that road from thousands and thousands of kilometers away. So that makes us kind of vulnerable on that food supply chain. And that really hit home a few years back when that one road was cut off by a landslide. And in the big supermarkets in the capital city of Whitehorse, the produce shelves went bare within 48 hours. And that was kind of a wake-up call. I had always assumed there was this endless supply of food in my grocery stores. In fact, in Dawson, we're another 600 kilometers away from Whitehorse, and the only thing that saved us in that time was one of the store owners actually, at his own expense, flew food all the way from Edmonton to Dawson. So that was when I started to really think about where our food comes from. And I also realize that a lot of nutrition, especially in fresh greens, is lost just within a few days of picking. So it really made me wonder how much nutrition was left in things like fresh spinach by the time it reached my plate. I also knew that Indigenous people in the North had eaten entirely local, of course, from thousands of years. And even 100 years ago, the Yukon used to produce way more of its own food. So I wondered if we couldn't do that again, if we could get away from our reliance on food from afar. And I thought that rather than research that, I would just try it. And I would use myself and my family as guinea pigs. So I took out every bit of grocery store food from our house, like every bit. And for 1 year, I tried to feed my family only food that could be grown, raised, hunted, fished, trapped, or foraged right around my tiny community of Dawson City, Yukon.
So there's this moment in the documentary where you get quite emotional because you're having your last afternoon tea before you decide to only eat the way that you decided for an entire year. So what was that transition like from going from grocery store food to only locally grown and hunted food?
At first it was extremely difficult. There were a lot of foods that I wasn't sure I could live without, caffeine being one of them. But beyond the food, it actually was just this really steep learning curve. I was kind of a blank page going into this. And so I wasn't really a very good cook. And then all of a sudden I was having to make my food from scratch, including all the ingredients. So, you need butter in something. Well, first you have to actually make the butter. I also had to learn how to recognize forageable foods that previously I'd either ignored or just thought were weeds. And then there was the whole preserving of food and storing of food. I mean, it was just really time consuming and tough at first. And I often found myself in tears. I really didn't know at the beginning if I was going to be able to make it through the next day, let alone a whole year.
So you mentioned your family, you have your husband, and you have 3 kids, and they sort of reluctantly came on board. So once you got into your groove, what did a typical meal plan for the day look like for your family?
Well, there was a lot of potatoes. There was no such thing as rice or pasta. And for the first 3 months, we had 0 grains at all. So potatoes became the really big filler. Breakfast, that would be eggs and potato cakes. We went through a dozen eggs a day. Lunch would be fresh vegetables, if we had them, dry meat, homemade cheese, homemade crackers. And then dinner was big. It was meat and potatoes, lots of moose, like roast moose with garlic and haskap berries smothered in birch syrup is just to die for, I have to say. So suppers were really good. And then as far as sweet things go, there was no baking. So it was birch syrup that was our main sweetener. So birch syrup ice cream, birch syrup custard, spruce tips candied with birch syrup. Those were some of the staples.
You have 3 kids. How did you convince them to give up the things that they love and the sweets and treats that they like to do this?
Well, my kids were conscripted. They did not go into this voluntarily at all. And they were all teenagers, so they had these huge appetites. They really missed their grab and go food and their usual snack food. And beyond that, there were all these extra chores that I needed their help with, especially at the beginning. So there were times when I wondered if my ideals were actually torturing my children and if I should just give up the whole process. But I really wanted to make it through a whole year. And, in the end, I'm incredibly proud of them.
Watching your kids go through this transformation, your whole family, they're so charming. But you could see the challenges that were being presented there. But what were some of the other challenges outside family that you faced during this adventure?
Storage was a really big challenge. Having to store a year's worth of food for a family of 5, I had no idea what that would look like. And some of that went back to olden days ways, root cellars and preserving, except that I didn't have any salt or any vinegar to help in the preserving process. No salt was another interesting challenge. At first, foods tasted incredibly bland, but after a while, I think my taste buds just sort of came alive and I didn't miss salt anymore and all the natural flavors just shone through.
What were some foods that you were surprised to discover that you can grow in your own backyard?
Well, lots of the forageable foods that I hadn't even recognized before that were growing in my yard, like wild rhubarb, for example, and spruce tips. Spruce tips are delicious. They're very citrusy. It's just the new growth on the spruce tree. Candied spruce tips are particularly good when they're boiled in birch syrup. And birch syrup, birch water, birch syrup, we don't have any maple trees here to tap, so birch syrup basically became our main sweetener. And then there were the things that I used to think were weeds, like lamb's quarter and fireweed shoots that I'd pull from the garden, and now I learned are really delicious. Now when I need to clear the garden, I actually eat what I pull.
You actually completed this challenge in July 2018, and it was quite hilarious watching in the movie because your family went straight out to the grocery store afterwards, and you seemed a little bit reluctant to dive back into that. But talk first about what was the first item that they really decided that they needed to have.
I think the first things that went into that grocery cart were bagels, coffee, Cheerios, peanut butter. They were the big craving items.
What'd you learn about food security and food sustainability out of this experience?
I really believe that one of the most important solutions is the local solution. It's just this incredibly humbling experience to know where every single ingredient on your plate comes from. And it just made me value and respect both the people and the land that brought me my food so much. That was the really big lesson for me.
So, Suzanne, it's been a couple of years since you've completed the challenge. Let's talk about what your eating habits for your family and for yourself look like today.
Well, I would say I still eat 95% local. Every fall, I still stock our house with a year's worth of food. All our meat and fish is local, all our eggs, our milk, our ice cream, our berries, all our vegetables are local throughout the year. I would say the one thing that's crept back into my life is chocolate. Not that I couldn't live without it. I found that I could, surprising to me, but it has crept back. For my family, I would say they continue to eat about 75% local. They do bring grocery store food into the house. I cringe every time, but in it comes. And they have peanut butter bagels back, and my husband's back on coffee.
Suzanne, your story is fascinating and insightful. We so appreciate you joining us today. First We Eat is available to screen at Hot Docs Online Festival. And don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.